Part 1. Introduction. A prophet in dark times. The land of Israel was in turmoil. A kingdom once chosen by God, blessed under the reign of David and Solomon, now stood divided and broken. The throne of Israel had fallen into the hands of King Ahab, a man remembered not for strength nor wisdom, but for the darkness he allowed to seep into his people's hearts. By his side stood Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name would echo through the centuries as a symbol of corruption, idolatry, and ruthless ambition. Together, they led the nation away from the God of their ancestors. Altars to Baal rose high above the hills. Sacred poles for Asherah dotted the land, and the people, once devoted to the Lord, bent their knees before false gods. A spiritual famine spread even before the drought would come. The nation was lost, wandering in a haze of idolatry, blind to the covenant that had made them great. Yet in the midst of this darkness, God chose a man, a prophet from the quiet town of Tishbe in Gilead. His name was Elijah. His very name carried weight. My God is Yahweh, and his mission would be as bold as his name. Elijah did not rise in palaces. He was not a man of wealth, nor one of noble birth. He came from obscurity, yet he was called to stand before kings. God often chooses the unexpected, raising simple men to deliver messages that shake the world. Elijah would be no different. In those days, the worship of Baal had consumed Israel. Baal was known as the storm god, the bringer of rain and fertility. Crops, livestock, survival itself seemed tied to him, at least. That's what the people were led to believe. Jezebel imported hundreds of prophets of Baal, feeding them from the royal table, silencing the prophets of the Lord. Many were killed, some fled, but Elijah remained. And then came the moment that would ignite his story. One day, Elisha stood boldly before King Ahab. The atmosphere was tense, for who dared to speak against the throne? Yet Elijah's voice did not tremble. He declared, with fire in his words, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." It was not just a prophecy. It was a direct challenge to Baal, the so-called god of rain. By declaring a drought, Elijah struck at the very core of Israel's idolatry. If Baal was truly God, then let him send rain. But if Yahweh held the skies, then Baal would be exposed as nothing more than stone and wood. Ahab must have been stunned. Jezebel would have burned with rage. Yet Elijah did not stay to negotiate, nor soften his words. He delivered the message and vanished. God had spoken, and the heavens were sealed. The drought began. At first, people may have brushed it off one dry season, perhaps, but months passed, then years. The land cracked beneath the sun, crops withered, rivers shrank into dust. Hunger and thirst spread like a plague. The gods of Jezebel were silent. Baal sent no rain, and in the silence of heaven, one man's words echoed, "Accept it, my word." But while the land suffered, Elijah was not abandoned. God told him to flee eastward, to hide by the brook of Kerith. There, in solitude, the prophet drank from the stream, and each morning, each evening, ravens swooped down, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. In the midst of famine, Elijah dined at the table of heaven. It was a picture of divine provision, a reminder that even when the world is barren, God sustains those who trust him. Night after night, Elijah would sit beneath the stars. The desert air cooled against his skin, listening to the gentle rush of the brook. The kingdom raged. Kings plotted. But here, in silence, Elijah was being prepared. Prophets are not made in comfort. They are forged in wilderness, refined in hunger, tested in solitude. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The brook, once flowing with life, began to shrink under the relentless sun. Cracks spread across the soil. Soon, the water that had sustained him dwindled to nothing. The brook dried up, just as the land around it. And yet, even in this, God was not finished with his prophet. What seemed like the end was only a new beginning. Elijah's journey was about to take him beyond Israel's borders, to a widow in Zarephath, a land consumed by the same famine. There, miracles would be born from jars of flour and oil. There, life itself would be restored from death. But all of it began here, with a man who dared to stand before kings, armed with nothing but the word of God. The stage was set. The battle between Yahweh and Baal, between truth and deception, between light and darkness, was underway. And at the center of it all stood Elijah the prophet, who faced kings. Part 2. Elijah's bold proclamation. The air was heavy in Samaria. Whispers carried through the marketplace. Murmurs of famine, of skies that refused to weep. The people lifted their eyes toward the heavens. But no clouds formed, no drops fell. Every day the earth cracked deeper. Every night the stars burned brighter against an empty sky. And at the heart of this crisis sat a king who had abandoned the God of his fathers. King Ahab was restless. His palace halls echoed with anger, with the sharp words of Jezebel urging him to crush any resistance. The drought had been declared by one man, a prophet who dared to stand in the royal court and speak words no one wanted to hear. Elijah. His name was a thorn in Ahab's pride, a reminder that even kings are not above the hand of God. It had been years now, and the drought had spread its claws across the land. The wells grew shallow, cattle collapsed in the fields, and mothers whispered prayers over their starving children. Yet no rain came. The prophets of Baal danced, cried out, cut themselves in devotion, but the heavens were silent. The so-called storm god was powerless, but Elijah had not disappeared into nothingness. While the nation groaned under judgment, the prophet listened. Every step he took was guided by a whisper from God. Every word timed for maximum impact. He had not chosen this fight, it had chosen him, and he knew that soon he would have to face Ahab again. Not in secret, but openly, boldly, before all of Israel. One day, after years of hiding and waiting, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was a terrifying command. Elijah was no fool. He knew the rage of the king, the wrath of Jezebel, the armies that searched for his life. But obedience does not wait for comfort. And so Elijah prepared his heart, straightened his cloak, and set his face toward Samaria once more. The encounter came with thunderous intensity. When Ahab finally laid eyes on him, the king's voice dripped with accusation, bitterness sharpened by years of drought. Is that you, troubler of Israel? Ahab spat the words, as though Elijah alone had caused the suffering of a nation. Elijah's eyes did not waver. His voice cut through the air like a blade. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father is a family of it. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. It was boldness unmatched. Few men dared to accuse a king, but Elisha spoke as though he stood in a higher court, answering not to thrones of men but to the throne of heaven. The silence that followed was thick, as though the earth itself waited to hear what would come next. Then Elijah issued a challenge that would echo through history. He told the king, Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Ashur who eat at Jezebel's table. It was a declaration of war, not with swords and shields, but with fire from heaven. Elijah was calling for a contest, a confrontation that would strip the mask from false gods and reveal the power of the living God. Imagine the shock in Ahab's court. The prophets of Baal, once confident in their numbers, exchanged uncertain glances. Jezebel's lips curved in disdain, perhaps masking the tremor of doubt in her heart. A single man, gaunt from years of exile, wearing the rough clothes of the wilderness, stood against hundreds. Yet his words carried authority, not because of who he was, but because of the one he represented. This was not arrogance. Elijah knew he had no power of his own. He was merely a messenger, a voice crying out in defiance of the tide of idolatry. And yet, when he spoke, heaven itself stood behind him. The announcement spread quickly. Word ran like fire through villages and towns. Farmers left their fields, herdsmen abandoned their flocks, families packed their belongings and traveled toward Mount Carmel. The nation was stirring, drawn by the promise of a showdown unlike any before. Would Baal prove himself at last? Would the prophets of Jezebel call down rain? Or would the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reveal his hand once more? Elijah's bold proclamation had set the stage, but the risk was great. If fire did not fall, if heaven remained silent, his life would be forfeit, his mission disgraced. Yet his faith was unshaken, for Elijah knew that the living God does not abandon his servants, and when the moment came, his power would be undeniable. The die was cast. The king had been confronted. The people had been summoned. And high upon Mount Carmel, amidst the stones and altars, a nation would soon witness the clash of gods, the testing of faith, and the revelation of truth. This was more than a contest. It was the soul of Israel at stake, and Elijah, the prophet who dared to stand alone, was ready to face kings, prophets, and all the forces of darkness in the name of the Lord. Part 3. The brook and the ravens. The words had been spoken. The drought had begun. And as Elijah disappeared from the palace courts, a quiet hush fell across Israel. It was as though the very heavens had sealed themselves shut in response to the prophet's declaration. Days turned into weeks, and the skies remained hard as bronze. Not a drop of dew kissed the morning grass. Not a cloud drifted above the parched land. The judgment had begun, and Elijah's prophecy was unfolding with terrifying accuracy. But what of the prophet himself? To speak such words before a king was dangerous enough. To live with their consequences was even more so. Jezebel's fury grew hotter with each passing day. Ahab's soldiers combed the countryside, seeking Elijah's life. And beyond the reach of the king's army, the famine spread its claws, threatening prophet and people alike. Yet God does not abandon his messengers. Just as Elijah had declared a drought, the same God who closed the skies now opened a path of survival. One evening, as the sun set red over the barren hills, the word of the Lord came to him. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kereth ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. The instruction was clear. Hide, wait, trust. For a prophet's strength is not in noise, but in obedience. And so Elijah walked into the wilderness, guided not by roads or signs, but by the voice of God. The land was harsh, dry winds scraping against his skin, dust rising with each step. Yet at last he came to a hidden valley, a narrow ravine carved by the flow of water. There, the brook of Kereth trickled quietly, a ribbon of life in a dying land. Here, Elijah would remain. He knelt and cupped his hands in the cool water, that tastes sweeter than wine to his parched throat. As the world starved, Elijah drank deeply from God's provision, but water alone could not sustain him. How would he eat in this wasteland, with fields failing and famine spreading? The answer came with the beating of wings. Each morning, as the dawn broke, ravens soared across the sky. They circled above, black silhouettes against the rising sun, before swooping down to the prophet's side. In their beaks they carried bread and meat, provision from an unseen hand. And as evening fell, When shadows stretched long across the ravine, the ravens returned again with their gift. Day after day, the cycle continued. Morning bread, evening meat. It was as though Elijah had become a guest at heaven's table. In the silence of exile, God fed him. In the loneliness of the wilderness, God sustained him. The ravens, unclean by the laws of men, became holy messengers of divine care. Imagine Elijah in those days alone beneath the open sky, listening to the steady murmur of the brook. Around him the land groaned with hunger, but in this hidden place he was at peace. Each drop of water reminded him of God's faithfulness. Each flutter of wings reminded him of God's power to provide in the most impossible ways. Prophets are not forged in palaces, but in deserts. Elijah's solitude was not a punishment, it was preparation. For in stillness, the voice of God grows loud, and in dependence the heart grows strong. Yet even the brook of Kerith was not eternal. As months passed, the stream began to shrink. The rocks, once slick with flowing water, grew dry. The sound of rushing faded to a whisper, then to silence. Day by day, the brook withered under the relentless sun, until only dust remained. The prophet who had declared the drought now drank its bitter truth. But Elijah did not despair. He had learned in the wilderness that God's provision is never bound to one source. If the brook dries, he will open another. If the ravens stop, he will send a widow. For the hand that shut the skies is the same hand that sustains his servant. And so, when the brook finally dried, the word of the Lord came again. Go at once to Zarephath, in the region of Sidon, and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. From the silence of the ravine to the streets of a foreign town, Elijah's journey was far from over. The God who had fed him by ravens would soon reveal his power in jars of flour and drops of oil, in life snatched back from death. But before the widow, before the miracles, before the fire that would fall on Mount Carmel, there was the brook and the ravens, a hidden chapter of obedience and trust. It was here that Elijah learned a truth every believer must face. When the world withholds, God provides. When kings rage, God protects. And when the brook runs dry, he leads us onward to greater works. For the prophet who faced kings first faced solitude. And in that solitude, he discovered the God who never abandons his own. Part 4. The Widow of Zarephath. The drought had deepened. What began as a judgment from God had now grown into a famine that spread across the land like a creeping shadow. Rivers shrank into trickles, and fields cracked under the merciless sun. Every day, more families went hungry, and even the wealthiest homes felt the sting of scarcity. Elijah, the prophet who once stood boldly before King Ahab, now lived a life hidden from sight. At first, he had been sustained by the brook Cherith, and the strange, miraculous provision of ravens bringing him bread and meat. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, even the brook dried up, leaving Elijah in silence with an empty stream before him. And then, as he sat in the stillness, God spoke. Arise, Elijah, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. The words must have stirred curiosity in Elijah's heart. Sidon was outside Israel, in the land of the Phoenicians. It was the homeland of Queen Jezebel, the very woman who hunted down prophets of the Lord and filled Israel with worship of Baal. Why would God send his prophet there into enemy territory? And more than that, why to a widow? Widows in that time were among the most vulnerable in society, often struggling to care even for themselves, let alone for strangers. Yet Elijah obeyed. He had learned by now that when God speaks, provision follows. The road to Zarephath was long and harsh, and Elijah would have felt the weight of the journey in the hot sun, dust clinging to his sandals, his stomach aching from hunger. But eventually, he arrived at the gates of the city. and there, just as God had said, he saw a woman gathering sticks. She looked weary, her clothes worn, her face lined with the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting to survive. Elijah called to her and said, "Please, bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink." The woman turned, perhaps startled by the stranger's voice, but she went to fetch it, and as she moved away, Elijah called again, "Please, bring me a piece of bread in your hand." At those words, the woman stopped. She turned back with eyes heavy with sorrow and spoke with a trembling voice. "As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a few sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her words painted the grim picture of her reality. She was at the very end. This was not just her last meal. It was her farewell to life itself. But Elijah, steady and calm, replied with words that carried both comfort and challenge. "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a small cake from it and bring it to me. And afterward make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jug of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." It was a test of faith, both for Elijah and for the widow. Would she believe the promise of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger at her gate? The woman stood in silence for a moment, the weight of choice pressing on her shoulders. She could refuse, holding tightly to the little she had left, or she could obey, giving up her last morsel in trust of a miracle she had never seen. And then, with trembling hands, she chose faith. She went and prepared the meal. She gave Elijah a small cake of bread, and afterward made some for herself and her son. And when she looked into the jar, the flour was still there. When she poured the jug, oil still flowed. Day after day, as the famine raged around them, the jar never emptied. The jug never dried up. It was a miracle of daily provision, quiet and steady, reminding them that God's hand was present in the smallest of things. But the story did not end there. One day, the widow's son grew sick. His illness grew worse and worse, until finally, the boy stopped breathing. The widow's grief poured out in anguish. She turned to Elijah, her words sharp and filled with despair. "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" Her heart, already scarred by hunger and hardship, now felt the cruelest blow of her child. Elijah took the boy from her arms and carried him up to the upper room where he was staying. He laid the lifeless body on his own bed, and with deep agony, he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodge, by killing her son?" Then Elijah stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and pleaded with God, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The room was still, and then life returned. The boy's chest rose with breath, color returned to his face, and his eyes opened. Elijah carried him back down to his mother and said, "See, your son lives." The widow, overwhelmed with awe and relief, looked at Elijah with new eyes. Her voice was steady with conviction. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. From famine to miracle, from despair to life restored." The story of the widow of Zarephath stands as a powerful testimony. God's provision is not bound by borders, not limited by circumstance, and his power reaches even the most unexpected places. Part 5. Showdown on Mount Carmel. The famine had now stretched into years. 3 long years of drought, 3 years of cracked earth and withered fields. 3 years where even the proudest cities of Israel had been humbled under the relentless sun. People whispered in desperation. Some cursed Elijah's name. Others cried out to Baal, Jezebel's god, hoping for rain, but the skies remained silent. King Ahab grew restless, his kingdom withering under the weight of God's judgment, and Jezebel, his queen, raged with fury, her hatred for Elijah burning like fire. She had already slaughtered many of the Lord's prophets, determined to silence his voice in the land. Yet, despite her cruelty, Elijah lived hidden by the hand of God. But the time for hiding was ending. God's voice came to Elisha once more. Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. It was time for a confrontation that would shake the very heart of Israel. When Elijah appeared before King Ahab, the king's eyes burned with accusation. Is that you, troubler of Israel? Ahab spat. Elijah's voice was steady. I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore, gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. The challenge was set, a battle of gods. The people of Israel would gather, the prophets of Baal would stand, and the Lord himself would reveal his power. Today, Kame. Crowds climbed the slopes of Mount Carmel, their faces weary, their hearts divided. Some still clung to the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But many had turned to Baal, the storm god they thought would bring rain. Elijah stood before the people and raised his voice so that all could hear. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people were silent. Their indecision hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Then Elisha proposed a test. 2 bulls would be prepared, one for Baal, one for the Lord. The prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on the Lord. The true God would answer with fire. The people agreed. It is well spoken, they said. The prophets of Baal went first. From morning until noon, they cried out, their voices echoing across the mountain. O Baal, hear us. They danced around the altar they had built, leaping and shouting, but there was no voice, no fire, no answer. At noon, Elijah could not help but mock them. Cry louder, for he is a god. Perhaps he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. The prophets of Baal grew more frantic. They cut themselves with knives and lances until blood gushed out, their bodies a spectacle of desperation. Or worse, pased but still nothing. No fire, no answer. When evening came, Elijah called the people to himself. He repaired the altar of the Lord that had been broken down, taking 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, to remind them of who they were, a people chosen by God. He built the altar in the name of the Lord, dug a trench around it, and arranged the wood. Then he cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the altar. But Elijah was not finished. He turned to the people and commanded, fill 4 water pots with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. They obeyed. Do it a second time, Elisha said. They poured again. Do it a third time. Water flowed down, drenching the sacrifice, the wood, and the altar, until the trench was filled. Elijah wanted no doubt this would be no trick, no illusion. Then Elijah stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not dance. He simply prayed, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven, not a flicker, not a spark, but a consuming blaze that devoured the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even licked up the water in the trench. The mountain shook with holy fire. The people fell on their faces, crying out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The moment of decision had come. Elijah commanded, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." The people obeyed, and the false prophets were brought down to the brook Kishon and executed. It was a victory unlike any Israel had ever seen. A moment where God revealed his power beyond question. Yet Elijah knew this was not the end. For though fire had fallen, the land was still dry, and Jezebel's fury was only beginning. Part 6. The sound of rain. The fire on Mount Carmel still smoldered in the memories of all who had witnessed it. The people had seen the power of God with their own eyes. Baal had been silent, his prophets defeated, while the Lord answered with fire that consumed everything in its path. The cry of the people echoed, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." But the land was still dry. For 3 years, not a drop of rain had touched Israel's soil. Crops had withered, livestock had perished, and families were clinging to survival. The spectacle of fire had turned hearts, but what the people needed now was water life itself. Elijah knew what God had promised. The same voice that had commanded him to confront Ahab now whispered again, "Rainey's coming." Elijah turned to King Ahab, who stood stunned at the events of Mount Carmel. The proud king, who had once called Elijah the troubler of Israel, had no words left. Elijah looked him in the eye and spoke with quiet confidence. "Go up, eat and drink. For there is the sound of abundance of rain to human ears." The skies above were silent, cloudless, and empty. Not even a hint of a storm appeared on the horizon. But Elijah, a man of faith, heard what others could not. He heard the promise of God, the sound of rain before the first drop fell. Ahab departed, perhaps puzzled, but obedient, to eat and drink. But Elijah climbed higher up Mount Carmel. He went alone to the very top, bowed down on the ground, and put his face between his knees. This was not the posture of a prophet basking in triumph. It was the posture of a servant in deep, desperate prayer. Elisha called to his servant, "Go up now. Look toward the sea." The servant obeyed. He gazed out across the vast horizon, his eyes straining to catch any sign of a storm. But the sky was clear, empty. He returned and said, "There is nothing." Elijah did not waver. "Go again," he said. The servant went, searched, and returned. Nothing. Again, Elijah said, "Go." Once, twice, 3 times more. The servant went and saw nothing. 6 times in total, he looked, and 6 times the report came back the same. Nothing. To wound your nails? It would have been enough to give up. 6 failures in a row. 6 clear skies mocking the prophet's hope. But Elijah persisted. He knew God had spoken, and so he sent his servant again. 7th time. This time, the servant's voice trembled with excitement as he returned. "There is a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea." It was small, almost insignificant, just a wisp in the vast blue. But to Elijah, it was the beginning of God's promise. The smallest sign was enough to reveal that the floodgates of heaven were about to open. Elijah rose to his feet and turned to his servant. "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down before the rain stops you." Even as he spoke, the skies began to shift. The wind stirred, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of rain. Clouds gathered, swelling and darkening until they covered the heavens. Lightning split the sky, and the first drops fell slow and fierce, then in torrents. The heavens unleashed their fury. After 3 years of silence, the sky roared with thunder and poured down rain. The parched earth drank deeply. Rivers filled, and the sound of water rushing across the land replaced the sound of drought's silence. Meanwhile, Ahab raced his chariot toward Jezreel to escape the storm. But something greater than rain had fallen upon Elijah, hand of the Lord. The prophet, empowered by divine strength, girded his robe and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot, sprinting through the storm, the rain soaking his body, his feet pounding the earth. Mile after mile, Elijah outran the king's horses, leading the way to Jezreel. It was not just a race, it was a declaration. The prophet of the Lord, sustained by faith, was swifter and stronger than the king who had abandoned God. The drought was broken. The rain had returned. Israel's land was refreshed, and God's power was undeniable. But this was not the end of Elijah's story. For even as the skies poured blessing, a darker storm brewed in the heart of Jezebel. The queen who worshipped Baal would not remain silent. Fire had fallen, rain had returned, but Jezebel's wrath was about to chase Elijah into the deepest valley of despair. Part 7. Elijah's flight in despair. The rain fell, washing the dust from the land, and for a brief moment, hope returned to Israel. But while the people rejoiced in the storm, in the palace of Jezreel, rage was brewing. Queen Jezebel's pride had been wounded on Mount Carmel. Her prophets of Baal slain, her God exposed as powerless, her influence challenged by a lone prophet who dared to stand against her empire of idols. She would not forgive. She would not forget. Word reached Elijah quickly, carried by trembling messengers. Jezebel had sworn an oath. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow at this time. It was a death sentence, declared with venom. The most powerful woman in Israel had vowed to kill him, and she had the means to do it. Elijah, the prophet who had called down fire from heaven and prayed rain into existence, was suddenly gripped by fear. His courage crumbled. The mighty man of God fled. He ran south, leaving Jezreel behind, leaving the triumph of Carmel behind, leaving everything behind. He crossed into Judah and went as far as Beersheba, a town on the edge of the wilderness. There, he left his servant and wandered alone into the desert. Days of exhaustion and despair weighed on him. The heat of the wilderness bore down, and Elijah's spirit broke. He collapsed under the shade of a solitary broom tree, and with tears choking his voice, he prayed, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." This was no ordinary weariness. It was the crushing despair of a man who had given everything, yet felt it was not enough. He had seen miracles, heard God's voice, and stood against kings. And still, the nation wavered. Still, evil seemed to reign. Still, his life was hunted like prey. Elisha felt alone, utterly alone. Exhausted, he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. But God had not abandoned him. Suddenly, he was awakened by a gentle touch. An angel stood beside him and spoke softly, "Arise and eat." Before him was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. Elijah ate, drank, and fell back asleep. A second time the angel touched him. "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." Again, bread and water appeared simple provisions, but infused with divine strength. Elijah ate, and this time the food sustained him for 40 days and 40 nights as he journeyed deep into the wilderness to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. The same mountain where Moses had once encountered the burning bush, the same mountain where the 10 Commandments had been given. There, in a cave on Mount Horeb, Elijah hid, his soul still heavy. He waited, and then came the voice of God. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah poured out his heart. "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." His words were drenched with loneliness, with despair, with the belief that he was the last flicker of light in a world swallowed by darkness. God did not rebuke him. Instead, he called Elijah to stand on the mountain before him. And behold, the Lord passed by. First, a powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks in its path. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then, an earthquake shook the ground, rumbling with force. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After that, a fire blazed across the mountain, consuming everything in its way. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then, after the fire, a gentle whisper, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and stepped out of the cave. There, in the silence, in the gentlest of ways, Elijah encountered the presence of God. The lesson was clear. God's power was not always displayed in storms, in quakes, or in fire. Sometimes his presence came quietly, softly, like a whisper to the heart. And again, the voice asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah repeated his lament. But this time God gave him new strength, not by removing the danger, but by reminding him of his mission. He was not alone. God had reserved 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. Elijah's journey was not finished. His purpose was not over. From the heights of victory to the depths of despair, Elijah's flight into the wilderness revealed a profound truth. Even the greatest prophets, even the strongest believers, can falter. Fear can grip the boldest hearts, but God, in His mercy, meets us not with condemnation, but with provision, presence, and purpose. Elijah had thought his story was ending under a broom tree, but on Mount Horeb God reminded him it was only beginning. Part 8, Ahab, Jezebel, and Naboth's vineyard. Elijah had returned from the wilderness with renewed purpose. The still small voice on Mount Horeb had reminded him that God was not done with him yet. His mission continued, and the struggle between truth and idolatry was far from over. Meanwhile, in the palace of Samaria, King Ahab continued to reign, and Jezebel's influence grew darker still. Though they had witnessed fire fall from heaven, though they had seen the rain return after Elijah's prayer, their hearts remained hard. Ahab still wavered, weak, endlessly swayed. Jezebel remained defiant, determined to crush anyone who opposed her will. It was in this atmosphere of power and corruption that a seemingly small story unfolded, one that would reveal the depth of Ahab and Jezebel's wickedness, and once again draw Elijah into confrontation. Near Thekin Espalis in Jezreel was a vineyard. Its rows of vines stretched neatly, producing fruit in season. The vineyard belonged to a man named Naboth. He was not a man of wealth or power, but a simple Israelite who treasured the land that had been passed down through his family for generations. To Naboth, this vineyard was not just soil and plants, it was inheritance, legacy, the sacred gift of God to his ancestors. One day, Ahab set his eyes on it. Perhaps he looked out from his palace window and admired its beauty. Perhaps he imagined the vineyard transformed into something more fitting for his taste. Whatever the reason, Ahab desired it. He approached Naboth with an offer. "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near, next to my house. I will give you a better vineyard in exchange for it. Or, if it seems good to you, I will give you its worth in money." The request sounded reasonable. Avenhay, Enedo, Uas, but Naboth's response was firm. "The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you." For Naboth, it was not about price or convenience. God's law was clear. The land was a sacred trust, not to be sold or traded away. Ahab returned to his palace sullen and angry. He lay on his bed, turned his face to the wall, and refused to eat. The king of Israel, with wealth and power at his disposal, pouted like a child denied a toy. Jezebel entered and saw his sulking. "Why is your spirit so sullen that you eat no food? Say, husk it." Ahab explained his frustration that Naboth had refused to give him the vineyard. Jezebel's eyes hardened. "Do you now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise, eat food, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite." With those words, she set a plan into motion. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with the king's seal, and sent them to the elders and nobles of Naboth's city. The letters instructed them to proclaim a fast and set Naboth in a place of honor among the people. Then, 2 scoundrels were to be seated opposite him, to accuse him publicly of blaspheming God and the king. Once the accusations were made, Naboth was to be taken outside the city and stoned to death. The elders, fearing Jezebel's power, obeyed. The scheme unfolded exactly as she had written. Naboth, innocent and unsuspecting, was falsely accused, condemned, and executed. His blood was shed not for guilt, but for greed. When the deed was done, Jezebel said to Ahab, "Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money. For Naboth is not alive, but dead." And Ahab went down to take the vineyard for himself, stepping onto the soil that had been bought with betrayal and murder. So the word of the Lord came to Elijah once again. "Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who lives in Samaria. He is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone to take possession. You shall speak to him, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, have you murdered and also taken possession? In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth, dogs shall lick your blood, even yours.'" Elisha obeyed. He went to the vineyard, where Ahab stood among the vines, no doubt savoring his triumph. But when he saw Elijah approaching, dread filled his heart. "Have you found me, O my enemy?" Ahab asked. "I have found you," Elijah replied. His words were sharp, carrying the weight of divine judgment. "Because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord, behold, I will bring calamity on you. I will take away your posterity and cut off from Ahab every male in Israel." And concerning Jezebel, the Lord also spoke, saying, "The dog shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." The judgment was terrifying. The vineyard that Ahab had desired became the scene of his condemnation. For a brief moment, Ahab's arrogance cracked. Stricken with fear, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted, humbling himself before the Lord. And in that moment of humility, God showed mercy, delaying the full force of his judgment until after Ahab's lifetime. But the stain of Jezebel's crime lingered. The vineyard of Naboth became a symbol of corruption and injustice, a reminder that God sees the hidden deeds of men and will not remain silent forever. The story of Naboth's vineyard reveals a sobering truth: the abuse of power, the twisting of justice, the shedding of innocent blood. These things do not escape the eyes of the Lord. Ahab and Jezebel thought they had gained a vineyard, but in reality, they had sown destruction into their own household. And Elijah, once again, stood as the voice of truth, fearless in confronting kings, reminding Israel and us that God's justice will always prevail. Part 9. Elijah's Final Acts and the Chariot of Fire. The years rolled on, and though Elijah's greatest battle seemed behind him, his mission was far from finished. Ahab, the king who had troubled Israel with his weakness and his wicked queen Jezebel, had fallen in battle. He died as Elijah had foretold, struck down and dishonored, his blood licked by dogs in the very place the prophet had warned. But though one chapter closed, another began, for the spirit of rebellion against God still lived, carried on by Ahab's descendants. And Elijah, though weathered by years of struggle, still carried the fire of God's purpose. In these later years, Elijah was not only a prophet of confrontation, but also a teacher, a mentor, and a man preparing to pass the torch. Among those who followed him was a young man named Elisha. Unlike the fiery, solitary figure Elijah had always been, Elisha was steady, compassionate, and patient. He plowed fields when Elisha first found him, a farmer with no thought of greatness. Yet when Elijah cast his prophet's cloak across Elisha's shoulders, the young man left everything behind to follow. Elisha became his servant, his apprentice, his shadow. And Elijah, who had walked so often alone, now found himself shaping the next generation. Still, Elijah's presence in Israel was not forgotten. Time and again, God used him to speak judgment, to confront kings, to remind a nation tempted by idols that Yahweh alone ruled. But beneath it all, there was a growing sense. His mission was nearing its end. Something greater awaited him. The day came when the Lord whispered into Elisha's spirit that his earthly journey was almost finished. It wasn't death. He would face but something far more extraordinary. Elisha canoed, and Elisha, sensing it too, clung to his master with fierce loyalty. The morning was crisp as they set out on their final journey together. Elisha, wrapped in his familiar cloak, walked with purpose, while Elisha trailed close behind. They traveled first to Gilgal, then onward to Bethel. At each stop, the sons of the prophets, small groups of disciples who studied the word of the Lord, came out to meet them. They whispered to Elisha, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away?" Elisha's face tightened. "Yes, I know. Keep silent." His heart ached at the thought of losing Elijah, but his determination never wavered. At Bethel, Elisha turned to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho." But Elisha shook his head firmly. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." And so, side by side, they went to Jericho. Again, the sons of the prophets warned Elisha of what was coming. Again, he silenced them. Elijah tested him once more. "Stay here, Elisha, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But Elisha's voice was steady. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." There was no breaking his loyalty now. And so the two men, teacher and student, arrived at the banks of the Jordan River. 50 sons of the prophets stood at a distance, watching with wide eyes, sensing that something holy was about to unfold. Elijah removed his cloak, the symbol of his calling, and rolled it tightly in his hands. Then, with a swift motion, he struck the water. The river shuddered, and the waters split, rolling back to the left and right until a dry path stretched before them. Together, Elisha and Elisha crossed on dry ground, just as Moses had led Israel through the Red Sea and Joshua through this very river generations before. On the far side, Elijah slowed his steps. He turned to Elisha, his gaze piercing but softened by affection. "Tell me," he said, "what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's answer came without hesitation. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah's eyebrows rose. It was no small request. A double portion was the right of a firstborn heir, the rightful inheritance of a son. Elisha wasn't asking for Gloria. He was asking to continue Elijah's work, with even greater strength, to carry forward the burden of Israel. Eliga Sigit, a mixture of solemnity and hope. "You have asked a difficult thing," he said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours otherwise." It will not. The air grew still as they walked on, their footsteps slow, each savoring these final moments. Then suddenly, without warning, the heavens erupted. A chariot of fire, blazing with the fury of God's presence, thundered down from above. Fiery horses snorted flames, and the whirlwind of God roared between Elijah and Elisha. Elisha staggered back, shielding his face, his eyes wide in awe. The chariot swept Elijah up, lifting him high into the storm, his cloak whipping in the wind. Elisha cried out, his voice breaking with grief and wonder. My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And then Elijah was gone, taken in the whirlwind, carried into heaven without tasting death. The fiery chariot vanished into the clouds, leaving silence and wind in its wake. Elisha stood trembling, his eyes wet with tears. The master who had defied kings, who had called down fire, who had raised the dead and silenced the rain, was gone. Only his cloak, that familiar mantle of rough cloth, tumbled to the ground. Elisha fell to his knees, tearing his own clothes in grief. But then he rose, his hands reaching for the mantle. He lifted it with reverence, feeling the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. The spirit of Elisha, the fire of God's calling, now rested upon him. Elisha turned back toward the Jordan. The sons of the prophets were watching from afar, holding their breath. Elisha rolled the cloak as Elisha had done, and struck the waters. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he cried. The river split in two. The waters obeyed, and the sons of the prophets, seeing it, bowed in awe. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," they whispered. The torch had passed. The story was not ending yet, was only continuing. And so Eliga, the prophet who faced kings, who stood alone against nations, who prayed fire from heaven and rain from the sky, departed not in defeat, but in triumph. His life burned with the flame of God, and even in his leaving, he bore witness to the power of the Almighty. The chariot of fire was not just Elijah's farewell, it was God's declaration that his servants, though human, were never forgotten. Elijah had lived with courage. He had spoken with conviction. He had faced kings and queens, famine and armies, despair and triumph. And now, lifted into the heavens, he became more than a memory. He became a legend, a prophet whose fire still lights the hearts of those who dare to stand boldly for truth. Part 10. Elijah's Legacy and Eternal Impact. The whirlwind had carried Elijah away, but his story did not end with the chariot of fire. In truth, that moment was only the beginning of his legacy, a legacy that would echo through the generations, shaping prophets, kings, and even the hope of nations. For Elijah was not just a man of his time, he was a man of eternity. Elisha, now bearing the prophet's mantle, walked in the power of his master's spirit. His miracles multiplied. He healed poisoned waters, multiplied oil for widows, even raised the dead. His presence proved that the God of Elijah was still at work. But while Elisha carried the torch, Elisha's name continued to burn bright in Israel's memory. He was not just remembered as a prophet. He was remembered as a man who dared to stand alone when the whole world bowed to idols. The sons of the prophets spoke of him with awe. They told the stories of Mount Carmel, when fire fell from heaven. They whispered of the day he outran a king's chariot. They remembered his voice, strong as thunder, proclaiming judgment to kings and mercy to widows. And with every telling, Elijah's story grew larger than life. Not just a man, but a symbol of faith, courage, and divine power. But Elijah's legacy stretched far beyond his own nation. Centuries later, his name appeared again in the writings of prophets. Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, delivered a striking promise. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. In those words, Elijah became not just a man of the past, but a figure of the future, a sign of restoration, a herald of God's coming kingdom. Generations of Israelites clung to this promise. They believed that before the Messiah arrived, Elisha would return. And so, his name lived in expectation. At every Passover, a chair was left empty at the table, Elijah's chair, waiting for the prophet to come back and announce the dawn of redemption. For Israel, Elijah was no longer simply a prophet of history. He was a prophet of hope. And then, centuries later, in the wilderness of Judea, a wild figure appeared. He wore a garment of camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist. He ate locusts and wild honey. His voice rang out like a trumpet. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. His name was John, and when the people saw him, they whispered among themselves, could this be Elijah? For in John the Baptist, the spirit and power of Elijah had indeed returned, bold, unyielding, preparing the way for the Lord. But Elijah's legacy reached even higher than John. One night, centuries after the prophet was swept into heaven, 3 of Jesus' disciples, Peter, James, and John, climbed a mountain with their master. There, Jesus was transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun, his clothes dazzling white. And suddenly, standing beside him, were 2 figures, Moses, the lawgiver, and Elijah, the prophet of fire. There he was, alive in glory, speaking with the Messiah about the fulfillment of God's plan. Imagine it. The man who once hid in a cave, weary and afraid, now standing radiant on a mountain, speaking face to face with the Son of God. His story had not ended with despair or even with the chariot of fire. It continued into eternity, woven into the fabric of redemption itself. But Elijah's legacy is not only written in Scripture, it still speaks to us today. For Elisha was a man, not a myth. He knew fear. He knew loneliness. He knew despair so deep he wished for death. Yet he also knew the power of prayer. He prayed, and the skies withheld rain. He prayed again, and the heavens poured forth abundance. He prayed, and fire fell from the sky. His story reminds us that the extraordinary is not born from human strength, but from trust in the living God. Elijah shows us that one voice, lifted in truth, can shake nations. He shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand firm even when afraid. He shows us that God meets us not only in the fire and the storm, but also in the gentle whisper. And above all, Elijah's life declares that those who walk with God are never truly alone. His story challenges kings and peasants alike. It confronts us with the question, whom will you serve? The idols of this world, which promise much but deliver emptiness, or the living God, whose voice still calls in the quiet? Elijah faced kings. Yes, but more than that, he faced himself. He wrestled with doubt, with weariness, with his own humanity. And yet, God did not abandon him. In the end, Elijah's life was not defined by his failures, nor even by his triumphs, but by the faithfulness of the one who carried him through it all. And so, Elijah's legacy is eternal. His fire has not gone out. It blazed on in Elysia. It flared in John the Baptist. It shone on the Mount of Transfiguration, and it still burns in the hearts of all who dare to believe that God can use the weak to confront the strong, the lone voice to challenge the crowd, the weary heart to carry a divine mission. The prophet who faced kings now stands as a witness across the ages. Not even death could claim him, for Elijah was taken up in glory, a reminder that God's promises are sure, and that those who walk with him are destined for more than this world can contain. The story of Elijah ends not in silence, but in fire that still calls us to faith, to courage, to trust. His chariot may have vanished into the heavens, but his voice still echoes. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. This is Elijah's eternal impact, to awaken the human heart to the reality of God. And though centuries have passed, his fire still burns, lighting the path for all who will walk in the way of truth.